Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf memvav. This month's learning is dedicated for a full shlema for Pesha Etel Bat Sarah, who is undergoing surgery today. Today's daf is sponsored by Mickey Kadosh and loving memory of Yudit Bat Boaz Chaim on her Shloshim. And today's daf is dedicated in memory of one of our most dedicated learners, Phyllis Hecht, who inspired so many other women to commit to daily Torah learning. She will be sorely missed by all of us. Okay, we're going to get started with the Chut HaShidra. So our first topic today is finishing up what we started yesterday with the Chut HaShidra. With the, if you remember, the Mishna had said if one of the vertebrae breaks, but it's not enough for just the vertebrae to break. It has to be also nifsak chut shela, that the spinal cord also is broken. Now, the question is, at what point is it no longer called a spinal cord? And we're going to talk about this in an animal, and then we're going to talk about it in a bird. So where does the spinal cord end? And basically, in an animal, it's basically the end part where it's kind of leads to the tail, and there's somewhere in between there where it ends. And we saw yesterday that it's until this area called the bein haparashot, which is where it starts branching off, and there's the spinal cord going right at the end of it. And there's 3 spots where it branches off into 2 other branches, come out of it and go into the body of the animal. So into the flesh. So now we said that the first one is for sure not a problem. The second one, we don't know. And the first one is for sure still part of the spinal cord, right, until the first. After the third, it's definitely not. And the question is what's in between. So again, what does this mean? It means once we say it's, let's say, the third, where it's pretty clear, it means if it breaks, it's not a treifa, because it's just not an important part of the animal anymore. So now, this by the way, is right where, it's right past where the bone leads to basically the pelvic bone and also the thigh, okay? So basically it's beyond that. That's what we're talking about. So now we say, by Rav Huna bereid Rav Yosef. So again, he said, Adachat treifa. Let's just go back to what Shmuel said. This is, if you remember, they were having this conversation as, Rav Dimi was about to go to Beit Chozai, and he goes to Rav Yehuda, and he asks him this question, and he asks him to show him, he says, bring me an animal, and I'll show you, but it didn't work. So in the end, he said, listen, this is the tradition I got from Shmuel. Adachat, until the first is a treifa, from the third is a treifa, is totally fine, and the second one, I don't know. Now, it's a little bit confusing, and this is what Rav Huna bereid Rav Yeshua is going to ask. By Rav Huna bereid Rav Yeshua, ad va'ad bichlal, or dilma ad v'lo ad bichlal. When you say until, right, there's a common question. Say, you can do this until Sunday. What does that mean? Do you have all day Sunday to do it, or is it until Sunday starts? So, right, ad va'ad bichlal, does it include, meaning up to the first and including the first, which means really including the first to the second. Right, and then it sounds like perhaps you would say including the first to the second, or maybe just including the first itself. It's unclear exactly. But if you read it as ad v'lo ad bichlal, you have until the first I understand, beyond the third I understand, but between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 is all up in the air. Or if you say ad v'ad bichlal means it includes the whole first separator, meaning until the second one, and then only then is going to start the suffix. And until the end of the first one would still be, for sure, a problem if it breaks. So he doesn't know. And then there continue to be further questions. By Rav Papa, im timtzelomer, if you're going to answer that question. Now, we didn't answer the question, but if you were to answer the question as ad v'lo ad bichlal, it's up to but not including, so then it's up to the first. But what about pi parasha mahu? What if you're at the point where exactly where it starts to split? Is that considered not included? Because it's up to the first, not including even that little spot. What if it cuts right there? Okay? Or do we say up to and including means up to and including where it splits? But it's up to and not including beyond that, but yes, including the Pia Parasha. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, not surprisingly, he asks questions here also. He says, Im timtzelomer, av abichlal parasha atzma mahu. What if you say it is including, okay? And then you say basically it's including, and then for sure the Pia Parasha would be included. But what about if the branches that branched off of there broke off? Okay, you still have the spinal cord there intact, but the pieces that came off of it break off, then what's the halakha? Is that, those pieces, are they considered also part of the spinal cord? And if so, and they're still in the part where we consider it the spinal cord, is it problematic or not? So they say, this we're going to try to answer, Tashma, ha-parasha tidon kebasal. The parasha itself, the split off, the two things that branch down into the animal, is just like the flesh of an animal, which if you have some tear or cut or broken piece, nobody thinks that's a treifa. So it sounds like they're totally fine. Even if you say ava bichlal, and it includes the pia parasha, the space where they start to branch off, but the branches themselves are not a problem if they break. But right now they say, my lav parasha rishona u'shniya. And when it says a parasha tidon kebasal, it could be the parasha rishona, the shniya, or the shlishit. Now, if you say, right, that we were trying to say that parasha includes the first or the second, because we're saying if it's ad v'lo ad bichlal, and it goes up until the first, or at least the first, let's say, and then the pieces break off, it's not a problem, even though the pia parasha itself would be a problem. So, right, shniya, so they say, lo shlishit. You could say, when it says a parasha is like the basar, maybe it means only on the third. But again, this was all if you say ad v'lo ad bichlal, right? It only goes up to, up to. But then the pia parasha might be included. Oh, sorry. We're in the ab bichlal. My mistake. Sorry. If you say ab bichlal, then that would include first until the second one. But the parashot might be just as problematic as the spinal cord itself. We don't know, because you could just read this line, parashat tidon kebasal, as specifically talking about the third one. And therefore, we don't really end up with an answer to any of our questions. Ba'ofa. So now what's the parallel in a bird? Because also there's a vertebrae, and then that leads basically to the wings. So Rabbi Yanai omer, ad lemata mina agapayim. And Rish Lakish amar ad ben agapayim. Okay, the agapayim are where the wings are. So Rish Lakish, let's just start with him. He says, until the point where the wings start branching out. Okay, I'm going to start with him because this is the easier one to say. Everyone agrees it's basically the spinal cord leads to right where the wings, right at the bottom of the spinal cord, that's where the wings branch out. That point, we're not going to consider it spinal cord anymore, where the wings branch out until that point, right? It sounds like an up until, right? So once you're past that, that's not the spinal cord anymore. But Rabbi Yanai says it's lower than the wings, which already means like some lower part, we're not really sure. But he extends the spinal cord and the bird further into the area where the wings start. It's not exactly clear where he ends. There's many different opinions about how to understand this. Amar Ula. Hava ka'imna kamed ben pazi, va'aita the kame ofa. Here's a great story, okay? Great story. Okay, it's an interesting story because it has all sorts of ramifications in terms of, or not necessarily ramifications, but this is a very common thing that happens, okay? I'm not really telling you yet what it is, so we'll see. But the main thing I wanted to point out here is, throughout this very technical, tedious, nitty-gritty details of all the different body parts and where what and what kind of treifa, which is a little bit, kind of tedious and maybe you call it a little bit boring, hard to, right? Get to understand all these different parts. But they are constantly interspersing real life situations that happen, because this is super common, right? Nowadays we don't think about these things because we're not shochetz and we don't deal with that, and we go to the butcher and we buy our meat and that's it. Now you can see why kosher meat is so expensive, right? Because all these things have to be checked, and it's very, very, fun. There's a lot of detail and all that. But basically, we have nothing to do with this anymore. But in those days, they were constantly dealing with this and grappling with it. And certainly the rabbis were getting questions all the time, and they were really in on all this stuff. By the way, when people learn for smicha, generally learn Chullin, because they, if you want to understand that stuff, even though it's not, most rabbis don't really deal with this anymore, but it is part of the smicha, learning program to be learning Chullin. So anyway, you'll see the real kashrut stuff comes at the end. That's more like the practical kashrut, other than just the treifas. That's something to be looking forward to. But there, you just see all sorts of real life situations happening. So here's a good real life situation. Amar Ula, hava ke'imna kameh ben pazi. I was in front of Ben Pazi, va'aitu lekameh ofa, and they brought him a bird. And what did he do? Right, badak ad ben agapayim. In other words, I guess there was a concern. It was a treifa, so he checked it until the ben agapayim. Okay, meaning the first point. So he starts checking it. He checks until the first opinion, which was Rish Lakish, right? Meaning first, meaning the earlier, right? All you have to check is the spinal cord until where the wings start. And then, Shalach le de benesiya. So while he was checking, he gets up to that point. And then he gets a message that the Beit HaNasi invited him to come. Come v'azil. So he gets up and he goes. and he leaves in the middle of checking. Now, what's the problem? Well, lo yadana. Ula says, I don't know. Did he stop there checking because he said, that's all I need to check? I hold like Rish Lakish, and all I need to check is to there. I'm done, and the Beit Nasi called me, I'm going to go. Or was it because of respect for the Nasi, that the Nasi called him and he said, okay, I'm going to stop what I'm doing, and I'm going to leave, and I'm going to go to the Beit Nasi. Maybe he really does hold, you have to check farther, but he was weighing the two things. I'm supposed to check this bird. On the other hand, they call me from the Beit Nasi, I got to get out of here, and he left. So this is a classic example of, a rabbi does something and nobody knows. Is he doing it because of the halakha, or is he doing it because something else came up and, he just had to leave, and doesn't necessarily mean that he thought that was enough to check for the treifa. So in the end, Ula's left with a big question mark, and I guess never saw Ben Pazi again to ask him what the story is, and we're left with not knowing who he held like. Okay, next. Nitzlah kaved. Okay, we're done with the spinal cord now, and we're moving on to the next treifa in the list. Now, if you remember, we talked about the liver, right? As long as there's anything left in the liver, right? And as with the Mishna it said, let's just read it because it's very important to read right now. It says the nitala kaveh velot nishtayer hemenu klum. If the liver's removed and there's nothing at all left, so what does it sound like? It sounds like, okay, I'm going to read it in the Gemara. Ha nishtayer hemena klum kshera. Afagav de lo havi kazayit. Right? It sounds like even if any little bit is left, even if it's not an olive bulk. Okay, now why would you think it would need to be an olive bulk? Well, you didn't read further on in the Mishnah, unless you did, and you happen to learn the Mishnah over the Perek, and this is a good example of where it probably pays to do that. If you look at the next Mishnah says, okay, which is on Daf Nun Dalid. Okay, we start on Men Bet. You can see how long it's going to take to get through all these cases in the Mishnah. But the Mishnah said, these are the treifot. And the next Mishnah says, and these are the ksherot. And it's the parallel. It's like an Elum Mitziot, if you remember. Like, these are the things, if you find them, you don't have to return them, and these are the things you have to return, right? So there's, right, Elum Mitziot Shalom, Elu Chayav Lachriz, right? These you have to announce about. And it's basically the parallel, just these are like that, and those are like that. So that it's going to be the same, like Nikva Gargeret, okay, right? By us, it was Psukata Gargeret, it was cut. In this case, it's just a hole, that's not a problem. Okay, Oshanistika. Okay, and it goes through. Now, one of them, when it gets to the liver, what does it say? Very surprisingly, Nitla kaved. Now, what would you expect? Nitla kaved v'nishtayer himenu. Right, something. Okay, it was removed, but a little bit is left. That would have been kasher. But it says here v'nishtayer himena kizayit. Oh wow, that's completely contradictory to our Mishnah, because right, so hatzna nitla kaved v'nishtayer himenu kizayit kshera. If it's a kazayit is left, it'll be kshera. It sounds like if a little bit is left, it's not going to be kshera. And our Mishnah seems to indicate differently. All you need is a little bit left for it to be kshera. So Rav Yosef lo kashya harabi chia harabi shimon berebi. So Rav Yosef says this is not a contradiction. It's not a contradiction because they can both live together because they each reflect different people's opinions. So one Mishnah is Rabbi Chia, and one Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi. Okay, now how do we know this? Ki had Rabbi Chia zarikla, Rabbi Shimon beRabbi mitabela, because Rabbi Chia would throw it out, and Rabbi Shimon beRabbi would dip it and eat it. Okay, he'd eat the liver. Now, what does this mean, and who holds what? So Rashi brings two interpretations. One is very intuitive, but Rashi rejects it, and the other one is very complicated, and Rashi accepts it for some reason. So I'll start with the obvious, the kind of clear one, that Rabbi Chia threw it out, meaning there was a case where there was a liver with less than a kazayit left, and Rabbi Chia said, not kosher, because it didn't have a kazayit left. That's the other Mishnah. And Rabbi Shimon beRabbi, who ate it, because as long as it had something left, it was fine, that's our Mishnah. Okay, V'simanech, how do you remember this? Ashirim mekamtzim. Ashirim, wealthy people, sometimes are the stingiest. He didn't want to throw it out. That's how you remember it. He didn't throw it out because he was stingy. Remember, Rabbi Shimon beRabbi, Rabbi was the Nasi. So because it was the Nasi, he was wealthy. So anyway, the point being, he didn't throw out the liver. Okay? So now we have, that's interpretation number one. Rabbi Chia matches, right? He threw it out. That's the next Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon beRabbi didn't throw it out. Now we're going to see this other this other opinion of Rashi. Okay, it's a little more complicated, but what Rashi says is Rabbi Chia, and then Rabbi Chia is going to match our Mishnah. Rabbi Chia would generally throw out the liver because he didn't think it was an important part of the body. Now, what does this have to do with anything? So Rashi quotes this line that says, Kol nefesh meshiv nefesh. It's a Gemara in Brachot. Anything that's part of the soul of the animal, if you eat it, it brings back your soul, meaning it's healthy. The healthiest foods are the ones that are essential parts of the animal's body. So he would eat it because he thought this was an essential part of the body, and therefore you need at least a kazayit in order for it to be a kosher animal because it's an important part of the body. And this is not saying he threw out a particular piece and he saved the particular piece and ate it. No, it's in general. Rabbi Chia would never eat the liver because he just thought it was not a part that was so critical, and therefore didn't think it was so important, and you can manage without almost any of it, right? Just a teeny little bit would be important, and would make it a treifa, as long as it has a teeny bit, it's not a treifa, versus Rabbi Shimon Berebi. And then they flip, according to this interpretation, which Mishnah matches who. Okay, that's just an aside about how exactly to understand this, but the point being there's a machloket, and each Mishnah reflects a different side of the machloket. Now we're going to see that really they held that it's actually, you need a kazayit, even though against our Mishnah that said you don't. Okay, you really do need a kazayit to remain. Otherwise, it's a treifa. Okay, now because of that, now we're going to see a story. This troop came through Pumpadita, these soldiers. Arku Rab of Rav Yosef, they ran away. Again, we're getting some background story that's not really clear why we're getting this story. But Rab and Rav Yosef basically got scared and ran away. Pagabahu Rabbi Zera, as they were running away, they meet Rabbi Zera who didn't run away. Okay, Amar Lahu, and he says to them, Arukai, oh you refugees. Like he was a little bit making fun of them, like what are you running away? You're scared? And then for some unknown reason, he starts telling them a halakha specifically about this kazayit of the liver. Okay, I don't know why, but he says to them, kazayit sha'amru bimkom mara. The kazayit that they're talking about, that has to remain from the liver, according to the next Mishnah, that you have to have at least a kazayit, is not just any kazayit of the liver, but it has to be the kazayit right next to the gallbladder. It has to be the part that's next to the gallbladder. That's the important part of the liver. And if you don't have a kazayit there, it's no good. Rav Adabar Ava Amar b'mkom shichaya. Adabar Ava says, no, you need a kazayit, but in the place where the life of the liver is, which there's a machloket among the commentaries where this is, because it's a pretty vague statement. Some people think it's under the kidneys, and some people think it's near this thing called the tarpash of the kaved, which in the Tanakh they call it, in the Torah it's called the yoteret hakaved. It's one of those parts that you burn on the altar, and which they sometimes call the lobe of the liver, and that's where its life comes from. And because, so there's a debate which one this one is, but it needs a kazayit either there or there, depending on the interpretation you go by. And now comes Rav Papa, Rav Papa, hilkach be'inin kazayit b'mkom hara, u'be'inin kazayit b'mkom shichaya. So Rav Papa says, he's always harmonious, we keep seeing this, he brings together the two opinions. He says, since one said it needs to be near the mara, and one says it needs to be near the place where the life of the liver comes from, therefore you need a kazayit there and you need a kazayit there. And if you don't have both kazayitim there, you don't have a kazayit there, an olive bulk the size of an olive bulk of the liver remaining in those spots, in both those spots, your animal's not kosher. Okay? Now, what's interesting is some of the commentaries later, because there's this debate, what the second interpretation is, they actually require 3 olive bulk sizes, because they require one by the gallbladder, that everyone agrees to, one by the tarpash of the kaved, right, this lobe of the liver, and one by the kidney, because we're not sure which opinion is right. So to be machmir, right, to make sure to fulfill all the opinions and not to eat an animal that maybe is a treifa, you need a kazayit in all 3 places. Some of the commentaries rule that way, not everybody, but that's interesting in terms of how psak develops. Okay, where here, our Mishnah said you don't even need anything, right, just a little bit, and now it turned into, right, this other opinion, you need a kazayit, and then these other rabbis said, well, it has to be a particular kazayit, not just anywhere in the liver, but in one of these 2 possible spots, and then that became 3, and okay, so you can see how things go. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, mitlaket mahu, kiritzua mahu. What if it's like pieces that add up to a kazayit, but they're not exactly next to each other, okay? They're not, can you combine them, okay? Have like a half a zayit here and a half a zayit there. Okay, would that work? Obviously, they both have to be near the gallbladder, but they're not connected. Or would it work by, again, classic Rabbi Yirmiyah question. Okay, what if, right? What if it's like this? What if it's like that? So he says, what if it's a strip? Okay, and it's not like, you would imagine like a ball of, a piece of the liver like that. By Rav Ashi, Kazayim Merudad Mahu, what if it's very thin? Okay, it's the liver in that size, but of an olive bulk, but not the depth of an olive bulk, like just the size, but it's all flat. Would that be okay? Teku. All those end in teku. We don't know the answer. Ba'amine Rabbi Zreika mi Rabbi Ami. So now Rabbi Zreika asked this question. Rabbi Ami nidal de la kavedu mu'ora b'tar pesheha mahu. What if it gets detached from all the body parts that it's next to, but it's still connected with this tarpash that we were talking about? It's kind of like a membrane that connects it to the body. Amarle dilzul. So Rabbi Ami answers him, dilzul ze eni yodea mahu. I don't know what you're talking about, because ilaman da'amar b'mkom mara ha'ika. Ilaman da'amar b'mkom shichaya ha'ika. This isn't a case where, until now we were talking about the liver missing whole parts of it. He says, in this case, the liver is existing. So whether you want it b'mkom mara or you want it b'mkom shichaya, the liver is intact. It's just not exactly attached properly, but it's still attached in its tarpashim. And of course, it's functioning, so I don't even know what you're talking about. The liver's there. It's attached in one place. Why do you need it attached to every other, all the other spots? It's fine. Okay, what he's really saying is there's really no question. Okay, so let's summarize the daf until this point, because now we're going to start with the lung, and that'll be a whole new section. So we'll do our summary for the first part here, which is, we finished up the Chut HaShidra where it ends. We talked about it in an animal, we talked about it in a bird, and we have all those questions about the Ava Bichlal. Until where, what do we mean, what was clear, what wasn't clear. In the end, we're left with a lot that wasn't clear. And where in a bird, and we saw the two opinions, and then we had that case of the rabbi who left in the middle, and it wasn't clear whether he was done with the job or wasn't done with the job. Then we had Nitla Kaved, okay, and then we saw this big debate contradiction between our Mishna and the next Mishna. We said they reflect two different opinions, which wasn't clear who was which one, depending on how you interpret it. And then we saw this case where then we said this. We saw this opinion, and while these rabbis were running away, Rabbi Zera taught them this halakha that the kazayit has to be bimkom mara. A different one said it has to be right by the gallbladder. The other one said it has to be makom shichaya. And we saw that in the end, Rav Papa brought them both together and said you need it in both. And then we ended with all these questions about what if it's like this, what if they're not attached, all different questions, and most of them we didn't answer. The last one we did answer. Okay, now we're moving on to the lungs. Hare ashenikva. So now you have a lung that is punctured. Rav Shmuel v'Rav Asi de'amre krama ila'a v'amrela krama tata'a. Okay, I wanted to read to the end just to see. There's two membranes. Okay, the lung is in its own membrane, and around it there's something else. If you look in the Quran, they have like all the names for these things. Okay, what they're called. Okay, they have pictures of it. There's the visceral pleura, which is the outer membrane. It's not exactly a membrane, they say, but it's some outer kind of thing that covers the whole lung. And then there's the alveoli, they call it, which cover, it's kind of like this inner membrane. Okay, if you know anatomy, that's helpful. If you don't, it's probably not. But it's very easy to just imagine there's two wrappings on the lung, okay? And that's going to be the whole question. So Rav Shmuel and Rav Asi say, we're talking about a hole in the outer one, and some people say that what they said was the inner one, okay? So there's this lack of clarity again, which one gets the puncture in it. That's going to be a problem. Amar Rav Yosef Bar Menyumi Amar Rav Nachman. How do you remember this second opinion, the krama tata'a? Simanech kitona devarda demancha bereya. It's like a red robe or a pink robe that has the re'ah in it. Okay, basically what we mean is the inner one. Okay, it's the inner wrapping of it that's reddish, because that one is reddish, and it looks like this robe that's basically wrapping it. Like you wrap yourself in a robe, the lung is wrapped in it, and that's how you remember it's the lower one. Pshita I inkav ila'a velo inkav tata. So now they want to kind of get to the halakha. Okay, it's confusing. We have these two different opinions. So they say, obviously, if the outer one is torn, velo inkav tata'a, but there's no perforation on the inner one, tata'a megain. It's obvious that the inner one protects. So why is it so obvious? And meaning it's not a problem. Kiderava, as Rava says, da'amar Rava, turning now to Amabed, hi rea de idlid. If you have a lung that the whole outer layer was peeled off, ke'ahina sumaka, and it looks like a red shriveled up date. Okay, that's what the lung looks like. Kshera, it's fine because it still has its inner protection. Inkuv tata'a velo inkav ila'a megain or lo megain. But what if the bottom one was perforated, but the outer one was not? Okay, the inner one was perforated, the outer one was not. Does the outer one protect the lung? You can imagine, it's a very obvious question, right? In other words, on the one hand, it has this protection. On the other hand, it's not as close, right? It's not as, right, the inner one is really, really protecting it because it's tightly around it. The outer one is a little looser, right? There's some space there, and maybe it's a problem. So Rav Acha and Ravina have this machloket. One says it protects, one says it doesn't protect. But we paskin that it does protect. Okay, so basically what we're going to say is, unless it is perforated in both, it's not a problem. Kid Rav Yosef. As Rav Yosef says, to Rav Yosef. Now Rav Yosef is going to give you two ways to test this lung, whether it has a puncture in both. Okay, because in the end you need a puncture in both, and it makes sense, right? The thing to think about here is something inflatable, okay? You buy these inflatable toys for the pool, right? And you all know that every once in a while, you're going to get a hole in one of them, right? And then, some of them, if you buy a good one, it comes with like a patch kit, and you have to find a hole, and you have to patch it up, and then usually you're okay. Okay? So think about that when you're learning this sugya, because it makes it very easy to understand. So that's basically the lung. The lung, you blow into it, right? The air goes through the kaneh, the windpipe, goes into the lung, blows air in. Now the whole problem is if the air gets out, then that's a treifa, because obviously the lung's not going to function if there's holes in there and the air comes out. So, Rav Yosef. Hi, Rea Da'avsha. If you have a lung with a hole in it, okay, well, actually, you don't know there's a hole. What you hear some sound of air coming out. That's why I think about the inflatable toys. Often, first of all, they start shriveling, but even then, you can hear this whistling noise, like, right? And you hear this air coming out, and you realize there's air coming out of it from somewhere. So, Yadinan, hecha avsha, if you can tell where the sound is coming from and you can figure out where the hole is, and here, now you're going to do your test, because what you want to do is, you want to figure out, is it from the inside or the outside? Is it going through both? So how do you test? Motvinan ala, you put right where you hear the hole and you hear the sound coming out, you put on top of it, gadfa, either a feather, or roka, or saliva, or gila, or straw. Treifa. If it starts to move up and down, okay, the saliva, I assume, will start to bubble a little. If it's the other stuff, they'll start to fly, right? They're very light, so the air obviously makes them fly up in the air. Then it's a treifa. Then you know the air is coming through there. Ilo, if not, kshera. If not, then it's going to be kosher, because it's obviously, there's air coming out, but it's not going through. So that means, okay, we're going to talk about what's the sound you hear. They're going to say it at the end of the second test. Now, what if you can't identify where the sound is coming from? This definitely happened to me. If you have like a really big inflatable toy, sometimes it's really hard to figure out where the hole is and how to fix it. So, maitina mitichlita demaya. You take a basin full of water, pashole, with tepid water. Okay, we're going to see in a minute why not hot, why not cold. Umutvina la begava. And what do? You put the lung inside the water. Okay? Don't put in hot water, because it will make it contract or constrict, right? And what will happen? The hole will close up. If you put it in cold water, don't do that, because it'll harden and then crack, and that won't help you. So you put it in the tepid water. Okay, just like before, you kind of put air in, right? So you blow air into it. Again, you have the windpipe, so you have a way to blow the air in. This is all, remember, after the animal's dead. So you kind of take apart the parts of the animal, and you put this in this basin of water, and you blow into it. Again, if it starts to bubble, the water, right, then it's a treifa, because you know that the water's coming out. Ilo, kshera, and if not, it's kosher. Now, they have to explain then what's the sound you were hearing if there's no water coming out, right? There's no water bubbling, there's no air coming out. Tata inkav, ila'a lo inkav. So the inner one must be where the hole is and not the outer one. V'hada avsha, and the fact that you hear this air sound coming out, zika de bene benehu. It's just the air between, right? You hear the air coming out from the lung into the outer membrane, but it doesn't matter, because it's not coming out of the outer membrane. And that's the test to figure out whether it has a hole or doesn't have a hole. Gufa. Okay, now we get into something that we mentioned before. We're just going to quote it. And from there, we're going to quote all sorts of statements of Rava. So Rava before it, at the very end of Amud Aleph, had said, Hi Rea de Iglit, if you have this lung, that the outer membrane is basically peeled away, Kahina Sumak, and it looks like a red date, Kshera. It's still Kshera because, again, it has the inner membrane protecting it. The Amoraim, another halakha Rava, said that this one Ravina is going to go against him and say, what you're saying makes no sense. But let's try to understand it at first. Re'ashe edima. If the lung turned red completely, well, again, we're going to see completely or partially. Miktsata, if only part of it is red, kshera. Some sort of internal bleeding, but it's not problematic because the assumption is if it's just a small part, it'll heal and get better and the internal bleeding will go away. Kula, if it's the whole thing, it's a treifa. Okay, if the whole lung is red, after you do the shechita and you see the whole lung is red, that's a sign of a bad sign. So there seems to be some logic in it, but Ravina comes and says there's no logic in what you're saying. And Rava's not going to respond to Ravina. Amarle Ravina la Rava. Miktsata my time. So why do you think miktsata? In other words, why do you say it's kosher? Well, the hadrabaria, I assume because you think it's going to get healed. Kulanami hadrabaria. But so will the rest of it, according to that theory. Meaning, well, he's going to quote a completely different sugya. It has to do with Masechet Shabbat. Okay, it's a sugya Masechet Shabbat. It has to do with Hilchot Shabbat. On Shabbat, if you injure a creature, okay, like an insect or one of those creepy crawlers, but there's no blood that comes out. If blood comes out, that's what's called a tolada. It's a tolada of shchita, okay, because shchita is taking out the blood, right, and killing it. So you didn't kill the creature, but if the blood comes out, you basically transgressed a shochet, a tolada of shochet. Excuse me 1 second. So that's a shochet. It's a tolada of a shochet is a chovel. That's if you take out blood, if you draw blood. But if there's only blood inside and there's only internal bleeding and not external bleeding, so the halakha distinguishes between the shmone shratzim that are tmeim according to Torah law, those 8 creatures that are listed, versus the rest of them. Okay, so right now we're going to start with the rest of them. So now the assumption is that there's a difference in the nature of the 8 shratzim and the rest of them in how when they have internal bleeding and how we view it. So Milo Tanya, does it not say in a Braita, Ushar shkatzim urimasim ad sheyetzeh mehem dam. If you cause internal bleeding, there's no problem with the other shratzim. Only if the blood comes out. But if there's internal bleeding, there's no problem. And now they're going to say like this. So let's go back. Miksatamai, so how do you view if there's a little bit of blood if it's reddish, right? If the lung is partially reddish, it's not a problem because we assume it'll heal itself. But look at the shratzim. In the shratzim case, it doesn't tell you, is it a majority? Is it partial? We view these shratzim, if there's internal bleeding, it will just heal itself, and it's not going to be a long-term problem. So if we're comparing it to that, we'll say the same thing here. The lung has internal bleeding. We're not worried about that. It'll heal itself. Doesn't matter if it's in part of the lung. Doesn't matter in the whole lung. Either which way, it's going to be fine. Or if you want to say, maybe it's more like the shmona shratzim, that internal bleeding is majorly problematic. Okay, and therefore, what in laws of Hilchot Shabbat, we're going to read it right now, Ditanya nitzrar hadam, if the blood collects inside, af al pi shelo yatsa, even if it didn't come out, you're actually going to be liable for Hilchot Shabbat. That's a tolada of hashochet. Because the internal bleeding is viewed as if it's external bleeding, either because it'll never get better, okay, and you basically ruin this animal, or because we assume it will come out eventually, okay, or something like that. It's a debate, and as I say something like that, there's a debate about exactly what the issue is. But in that case, internal bleeding is a problem. Well, then ihachi afilu miksatanami. If you're going to say the lung is more like the shmona shratzim, and again, we're not viewing a body like a creature. We're just saying there seem to be these 2 models. One is internal bleeding can just heal itself, and the other is internal bleeding is serious. And it depends on whether it's one of the shmona shratzim or not. Same thing with the lung. And the lung, either the internal bleeding is a problem or it's not a problem. Either which way, it shouldn't make a difference, partial or complete. It should either all be a problem or all not be a problem. And that's why he says, Ela loshna. Therefore, it doesn't matter miksata. It doesn't matter the whole thing. Either which way, fill in the blank. it's a problem, or it's not a problem, we don't know what he holds. Okay? And the commentaries disagree about what he holds. And as we know that he disagrees with Rava and doesn't think to make this distinction. Rava said Miktsata is fine, whole thing is a problem. Ravina, some of the commentaries say it doesn't matter the whole or part, it's definitely not kosher, and some people say it says the opposite. So it's unclear. Okay, moving on. Amar Rava, another statement of Rava about the lung. If some of it dries up, it's a treifa. Vikama. Okay, what does it mean? Sorry, it partially dried up. What does it mean partially dried up? How much dried up does it need to be for it to be a treifa? Amar Papa Mishmei Rava, Kadesha tifarech b'tziporin. If you touch it with a nail, it'll start to disintegrate. Okay, that's how dry we need for it to be called a treifa. So if it's that dried out, it's a problem. Kiman, according to who does this match? Rav Yosef ben Meshulam. And now again, we're going to bring a totally different sugya, although this is a little more similar to the Shratzim one. But we're going to bring a sugya of a blemish in a bechor. If you remember, the firstborn animal goes to the Kohen. Kohen has to bring it to the temple to sacrifice it, but not if it has a blemish, because blemished animals can't go on the altar. So we're going to have a debate about what is considered a dried out ear. Okay, we're talking about an ear, so it's not the same thing. But what is considered a dried out ear for a bechor to be considered a blemished bechor? So if the ear is dried out, it's a blemish. So how dry? And here we're going to see Rav Yosef B'Shalom is exactly what Rava must hold by him, because he says the exact same thing. Again, we're talking about in the lung, he was talking about the ear, but the assumption is it's the same. Tanya ezohi yevesha. So this is a bright and bechorot. What's yevesha? She'im tina, it's dry. She'im tina ke ve'ena motziati patam. This is Tanakama. If you make a hole, you punch a hole in the ear and no blood comes out, that's dried out. Rabbi Yosef ben Meshulam omer yevesha kedei she'nifrechet b'tziporen. Exactly the definition Rabbi used. Dry, that if you touch it with your nail, it's going to disintegrate. But the Gemara says, wait a minute. Who's to say those cases are comparable? Maybe afilu tema rabbanan. Maybe you could say Rava holds like the rabbis when it comes to the ear, but here he needs it to disintegrate, fall apart when you touch it with your nail. But gabe ozen bechol de kashalet bezika lo hadrabaria. But by the ear, where there's air, okay, now whenever air gets in, we all know, right, we call it bacteria, right? It could get infected with all sorts of bacteria in the air. It's much more likely to get infected with bacteria when it's exposed to all sorts of things. So the ear, where there's air and bacteria and all sorts of things floating around, lo hadrabaria. It's not going to get healed already at that stage of no blood is coming out. Aval re'ah, but the lung, de lo kashalet be'avira, where there's no air because the lung was inside the body of the animal until we took it out, right? But we're talking about what was it when the animal was still alive, hadrabaria. Maybe it's protected in there and it could get better even if it's dry in the way that the ear would be. So his criteria for dry would have to be even greater. So maybe even the rabbis who said by the ear, as long as there's no blood that comes out, if you puncture it, in the lung it will be a bigger threshold. In other words, you'd have to get to a higher threshold of, or I don't know if it's higher threshold, lower threshold, but you would have to get, you would have to get to the point where it's so dry that it falls apart when you touch it. That would be the criteria for there. So it's not necessarily clear that Rava holds like Rabbi Yosef ben Meshulam in the case of the Bechor. Va'amar Rava. Two more halachas of Rava. Hai rea dekaim, actually three. Hai rea dekaim gilde gilde, ukame ukame, chazvata kshera. If you have a lung that has all sorts of things on it, like some external thing, like a scab, okay, that's gilde gilde. Ukame ukame are black spots. Chazvata is some colored spots, or there's different opinions what it is, but maybe some colored spots. That's all fine. Okay, those spots on the lung are not an issue. Amoraim Mishmei Rava. This one at least was quoted in the name of Rava. Ein mekifim bevue. Okay, what does this mean? This means that if you have a perforated cyst and you want to, what you're not sure about, okay, you shechted this animal, you don't know if the perforation happened now or did it happen earlier. So often the best way to do that is take another cyst, perforate it, and see what it looks like. And if it looks the same, then you know it was just perforated now. If it looks different, then you can assume the perforation might have happened before the shechita, and then you're going to disqualify it. But he says you can't check that way, because any other perforated cyst you're going to do is not going to necessarily look the same, and it's not going to help you to figure out. So basically he says that's not a good test to do, and it doesn't help you. So I guess you have to be machmir if you find a perforated cyst, and basically say the animal's a treifa. Last halakha for today. Amoraim. Hane tarte une disrichen lahadade leit lehu bedika. Okay, there's basically 5 lobes of the lungs. There's 2 on the left, 3 on the right. And now we're going to talk about those lobes. What if they get stuck to each other? If they're stuck to each other, there's no way to check. I'm basically saying you have to call this a treifa. The lo amaran, and I'll explain this in a minute, but let's just finish. Lo amaran ela shelo kesidran. This is if they're not the ones that are adjacent to each other. Okay, like if the one went with the third one. Okay, the first lobe on one side, right on the right side, there's 3, and it's the 1 and the 3 stick together, or 1 on the right with 2 on the left, or something like that. Okay, but kisidran hanu revitayu. But if they're closed up together and they're stuck to each other and they're the ones next to each other, that's the way, it's kind of natural. Okay, what's the issue? Good question. So there's 2 opinions here, or at least, okay. According to Rashi, they're assuming that the adhesions were caused by a perforation, okay, because if there's perforation, right, things come out and then they, maybe some liquid jets out and it causes the adhesion, and maybe that's the problem. But other people say that it's more that that if they're put together, okay, now you have to remember, at this point we're after the animal's dead, and we have these 2 parts stuck together. But it means that they were stuck together in the animal. Now, if they're stuck together in the animal, at some point they're going to come apart, and when they come apart, it's going to tear, right? When you stick 2 pieces of paper together, you glue them and then try to separate them, right? They're going to tear apart. So it basically would have led to a perforation in the animal, in the lung, so it didn't yet, right? So Rashi thinks it's already there. Okay, this is, I think, Rabbeinu Yitzchak says that it's because once they're together, they're going to end up being perforated, and that's going to create a problem. Okay, we're going to continue with a bunch more statements of Rava in tomorrow's daf, so we're not done yet with the lungs. But the second part of today's daf, which, again, I reviewed already, the first part about the spinal cord and the liver. Now we dealt with the lung, and we talked about the 2 membranes, and in the end we paskin that you need both membranes to be torn for it to be a problem. And Rav Yosef gave us all these tests, how to figure it out if we know where the air is coming from or we don't know where the air is coming from, right? One we do with just the feather or something like that, and the other we submerge the whole thing in water and see if the water bubbles up or not when we put air in. Then we had a slew of halachot of Rava about the lung and different checks and different things that you can identify whether this is a treifa, this is not a treifa. We have one that Ravina completely disagreed with him about the redness in the lung. And with that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a chodesh tov and wishing everyone to have a good day.